Welcome to another Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolutely fascinating, and honestly, kind of wild, history of a figure whose identity has shifted drastically over millennia. We're talking about Astaroth. You know, we usually think of mythological and religious figures as these static, unchanging things that have always just been exactly the way they are right now. But as you're going to see, these figures actually evolve right alongside human civilizations. They completely shapeshift across empires and eras.
Okay, picture this. Listen to this totally terrifying description from Renaissance occult literature. This is straight out of the Goetia, which is this famous text that maps out all these demonic hierarchies, and it introduces us to an entity known as Astaroth. When you hear this, a male figure riding a literal dragon, clutching a venomous viper, and having foul, toxic breath, you definitely get a very specific image in your head, right? It's explicitly designed by the authors back then to just completely evoke fear, disgust, and pure malevolence.
But here is the massive plot twist. This frightening, dragon-riding, foul-breathed Duke of Hell, he actually originated as a deeply revered, immensely powerful female deity. Yeah, no kidding. It is literally one of the most drastic identity shifts in all of recorded mythological history. We are talking about a complete 180-degree inversion of gender, status, and morality. So, to wrap our heads around this wild transformation, we've got a quick roadmap for our explainer today. First, we'll officially meet the Grand Duke. Then we'll dig into his ancient goddess roots, break down the monotheistic shift, check out the grimoires, and finally wrap up with modern occultism. Let's dive in.
Now, right off the bat, it's super important to remember we aren't just studying literal monsters today. When we look at demonology objectively, we're actually using these old texts as a mirror. The entities that different cultures label as evil tell us so much about their deepest anxieties, their forbidden desires, and their core values. Basically, to study a culture's demons is to study the culture itself.
So, part 1, let's meet the Grand Duke.
If we look closely at the lore of Astaroth exactly as he shows up in traditional occult texts, there is this totally bizarre paradox. According to the texts, you'd summon this terrifying, foul-breathed demon to, what? Tell you the future, reveal lost objects, and help you make friends? It makes no sense. He's this Grand Duke who can supposedly manipulate earthly kings, yet he's also summoned to help you find your lost keys and boost your social life. But, this perfectly highlights the everyday human desires, like knowledge, wealth, and connection, that people have always projected onto these unseen forces.
All right, moving on to part 2, the ancient goddess roots.
This is where the history gets absolutely fascinating. That demonic guy we just talked about was originally an incredibly powerful ancient goddess. Talk about a downgrade, right? What was once the queen of heaven in ancient Mesopotamia, literally celebrated for love, beauty, and the fierce power of warfare, was entirely inverted into a manipulative male figure from hell. Everything about her was just flipped completely upside down.
Her original influence was just immense across the ancient Near East. Whether she was known as Astarte in the Levant during the Bronze and Iron Ages, or as Ishtar even further back in Mesopotamia, her following was massive. We are not talking about some minor background deity here. She was woven right into the very fabric of society. She embodied these incredibly complex, potent forces that resonated really deeply with the ancient world.
Which brings us to part 3, the monotheistic shift.
So, how on earth did a revered queen of heaven turn into a literal duke of hell? Well, as monotheistic religions started rising in the region, they naturally had to compete with the older polytheistic beliefs. The Hebrew Bible, for example, vehemently condemned the worship of foreign gods, referring to Astarte as Ashtoreth, framing it all as dangerous idolatry. Over centuries, as religions consolidated power, the deities of competing or conquered cultures were systematically transformed into symbols of pure evil. Astarte wasn't just casually forgotten, she was actively redefined as the enemy.
Up next, part 4, powers and grimoires.
Fast forward a bit, and Renaissance occult literature really formalized this whole demonization process. Books like the Goetia didn't just casually mention Astaroth. They meticulously cataloged him. They gave him an official rank, a title, a specific physical description, and even step-by-step rituals to summon him. They basically took the demonized remnants of this ancient goddess and structured them into this highly organized, almost bureaucratic vision of hell. It's like corporate structuring, but for demons.
Finally, part 5, modern occultism and psychology. Today, a lot of modern practitioners and psychological thinkers are looking at Astaroth through a much more nuanced lens. Instead of seeing literal pitchfork-wielding evil, many see an opportunity to reclaim marginalized feminine power. They look right past the Duke to honor the original goddess, Astarte. Others use the figure purely as a psychological tool, a way to confront their own shadow self, those repressed hidden parts of our own psyche. They're seeking self-awareness and personal growth, instead of just cowering in fear.
And a huge part of this modern approach is something called personal gnosis. Rather than just blindly following those old dogmatic grimoires that insist you should be terrified of Astaroth, modern occultism often prioritizes direct, personal spiritual experience. People develop their own independent, highly personal understanding of these entities through things like meditation and reflection, figuring out what it means to them individually. So, if we recap Astaroth's incredible character arc across human history, the journey looks exactly like this. We start way back in the Bronze Age with a widely worshipped goddess. Then, by the Iron Age, she's condemned as an idol by early monotheistic faiths. Jump to the Renaissance, and she's been completely transformed into a feared male demon in occult texts. And finally, today in the modern era, the figure is being re-explored as a psychological shadow and a symbol of reclaimed power. What a journey!
It really hits home that the way a culture draws its demons tells us exactly what that culture is secretly terrified of. The transformation of a powerful goddess of love and war into a manipulative, foul-smelling demon, that strongly reflects some very real historical anxieties. It reveals a deep discomfort with female power, a definite fear of open sexuality, and a highly defensive posture against the perceived threat of foreign religious influence.
Which brings us to one final, provocative thought to wrap up our explainer today. If the monsters we write about and fear are actually just mirrors reflecting our own societal anxieties and our repressed desires, well, when we look at the demons of our modern era today, what are we really afraid of? Thank you so much for exploring the incredible, shifting history of Astaroth with us. It's a powerful reminder that while history is often written by the victors, the truth is always out there just waiting to be unearthed. Catch you next time.